So before I start, who's actually used Umbraco Cloud in here? Hands up. Fair decent amount. Who's done deployments with Azure DevOps or GitHub before? Yeah? Not so many, but yeah, pretty close. Now, who's actually tried doing CI/CD with Umbraco Cloud before? Ah, a couple of you. Excellent. Okay. So when this came out, I got rather excited because I was really sick of pushing up the cloud and then having to pull changes down. And what happens if someone else wanted to make a change? And what happens if we had changes that we weren't ready yet to deploy? And all of that fun. And by the way, what happens if someone pushes up something and it breaks? So I first got into Umbraco, the CI/CD side of things, got on the beta test of it and broke a lot of stuff as I was going through, as I normally do. I'm very good at breaking things. In fact, I actually broke my demo 3 hours ago and spent the next 2 hours fixing it. So I'm off to a good start. Yeah, so let's have a look. So just some basics. We have a website on the left and we have Umbraco Cloud on the right. And so up until about 12 months ago, the only way was to just do a direct deployment through. And effectively, that would be a git sync. So you'd commit some stuff, push it up, and then if you're on a different computer or someone else needed to do it, you'd pull it down again, and so on. And then CI/CD came along, and we stuck a Git repository between the two of them. And so then our workflow changed to pushing to your own repository, syncing with that, completely separated, firewalled off, if you like, from the cloud. And then we had pull requests, possibly, maybe, because that's really why you do it in the first place, is so that you can actually control who does what and how the code gets in and do your code reviews and security and testing and everything else that pull request gives you. And then that pull request would kick off a pipeline which would then push everything up, theoretically, push everything up and synchronize it with the cloud. One important note about that, though, is it's not actually a Git sync, it's not a Git push and pull, it's actually pushing up a package of files into a different location on cloud, and then the API on cloud pulls that package of files and does all the Git stuff on the cloud. So you don't actually get to operate directly on the Git repository doing it this way. So let's have a look at how we go about setting this up. Now, is that big enough for everyone? Yep, up the back, see it okay? Great. All right, so first thing to note, if you're doing a fairly typical CI/CD deployment process, then you would have something that you'd have your pipeline, and it might have some variables, the usual stuff, and then you've got some stages. And you would have a build and test, perhaps. You check out your code, you run some tests, you'd make sure you build it, it compiles properly. All along the way, you check whether it's going to fail or fall over. And you might build your client as well. And then you would do a deployment and push it up to whatever it is you're pushing your code to, whether it's something like an Azure App Service or AWS or wherever it might go. When it comes to Umbraco Cloud, we have some ready-made scripts that you can download directly from Umbraco's Git repository, and there's a link to those on one of the last slides in resources. And yeah, before we get into that, let's actually do something and see how this goes, and hopefully I've fixed whatever problem I had 2 hours ago and it will actually fly. So I'm just going to make it, doesn't really matter where, I'll do it in my pipeline here and push it up. And if I can get past all the commits and stuff, that is. There we go. And we'll call this one testing. And I like icons, what can I say? So where's my deploy one gone? Doesn't matter, we'll do that. Actually, let's launch it as well. There we go. We get our little rocket. Sync it up. And we give that a second or two. Yep, good, it's gone. Okay, come over to our Git repo, do our pull request. There we go. We're going to do a test deployment directly into main. The only reason I'm doing this now, I'm not going through everything first, is because it literally takes about 15, 16, 17 minutes for the whole thing to complete. So there goes half the time, right? So if we do it now, we'll come back to it and see if it worked or not. Okay, now I've set up approvals on this so that someone needs to approve it. Luckily it's me, that helps too. Generally, it would be someone else or maybe two approvers, whatever. I normally add in the requirement to include work items as well, and of course, any comments need to be resolved before you can go much further. So that's going to kick off our pipeline. There it goes there. And we'll have a look at how this goes and what it's doing as it's going along for the first part of it, because that's relatively quick. So the first thing it's doing is it's actually going up to Umbraco Cloud, and it's going to go and check for the last deployment there and look for anything that's changed between now and then. And it's going to pull down a patch. Looks like there's actually not much to do, so let's see, we'll go through the steps. And it's basically going through checking Umbraco Cloud, and it's doing the git config and all of that. It gets the latest deployment and so on. And there should be another one coming up. Here we go. So checking if there's any changes. So that pulls down any patch files. It'll skip over automatically if there isn't anything to actually be pulled back in. And so far, so good, smooth sailing. This particular part here, that's pretty much out of the box with Umbraco Cloud with the scripts that you can get. And then if there is something to apply, it'll go and apply it as well. So it'll check out Umbraco, well, check out, what have I got there? Check out, yeah, that's just the repository itself. So it'll check out the latest code from your main. It'll apply whatever diff has been stored up in the previous task. And theoretically, it will apply that patch and continue on its merry way, provided you haven't caused a conflict, in which case, that'll just completely ignore it and just go and deploy what you've got up anyway. So that's really handy. And that's what I came up against 2 hours ago. So I'm like, oh, what happens if I do this? And now I know. So lesson learned, don't go making changes in cloud, but we already know that, don't we? Because if you do that, you've got problems anyway. So our next stage is our build and test, and that's pretty standard stuff. It builds the project. There is one major difference here, though. We don't actually push the built assets. We push the source code up. Because Umbraco Cloud is going to build it all for us anyway, we don't actually have to push up the DLLs or anything like that. We actually don't even need to push up all our extra project files that aren't necessarily going to be part of that package. So there's a step here called build client, so that's building our front end and putting the compiled version of the front end into the Umbraco project. And that compiled version will end up going into the Git repository on Umbraco Cloud. So here we go, we're off building, and then I have another post job which is coming up very soon called Checkout Umbraco Cloud. Here we go, it's about to kick off by the look of it. No, they're still doing the restore. So we'll give it a minute. There we go, done. So this checkout part here, I've actually moved that out of the stock standard Umbraco way because I needed to include those client files. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But basically what it's doing, if I can get to it. Hang on. Did I manage to incorporate? Oh, no, here we go. Yeah, prepare deployment. Yes, that's right, that's what I did. I got tricky and confused myself. So with this deployment step, it does another checkout because it's basically in a separate job, and each job checks out its own code and all the fun of it. So we actually need to redo our client packages here. The reason we did it in build and test was so we could test our front end as well if you're using Selenium or whatever it is that you're using, or automated testing. But you also need to do it in your deployment step, because the deployment step will take the code that's in your repository, package up the into a zip file, push it up, Actually, it doesn't. That comes next. But what it is, it takes a zip file, publishes it as an asset, and then the next stage, which is now running here, and we'll go into that in about, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes, hopefully, that will actually take that zip file, push it up, and do what it does. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail while that's keeping on running. So we've already gone through pretty much what all that does. We've got our deployment job here, well, prepared deployment rather. And then down here we have this cloud deployment stage, which is the template that Umbraco gives you for actually deploying. So part of that package, if you like, that you can get download from GitHub is a stack of scripts that Umbraco have written. These all they basically connect to the API on Umbraco Cloud, and this one creates a deployment, this one gets the changes by ID, then you've got deployment status, get the latest deployment, start deployment, and upload package. So they connect to the API for CI/CD on Umbraco Cloud. These two templates here, we have our Cloud Sync one, so that does the heavy lifting of pulling down any changes, and basically it's fairly easy to follow. You can see here that it's trying to get the patch file and create that, and then there's this little task here that tries to merge that patch in with your code or with your repository. In the early days, you actually had these two steps, so you would actually pull that into a separate branch, and then you would have this manual approval task which would send off an email if something's changed saying, I need you to go and check it, please check, and all the rest of it. So there was a manual step in the early days, but then that's been replaced with this one here. And I'm still a bit dubious about this because conflicts break stuff, but then you're probably going to have that problem anyway, and you have to go through, and there's ways to fix it, but it gets messy very quickly. Okay, so the deployment side of things. So in here we have the upload source and start deployment. Now, what's interesting, this commented bit out is actually been moved to my main pipeline simply because I wanted to incorporate the client files as well. This is actually key. So we have a few things here. We have a cloud.ignore file, which we'll find in here. And we have a cloud.zipignore file. So the zipignore file is designed so that you can send to the zip command this file that excludes anything that's listed in that file. And it's very similar to a gitignore file. So the syntax is basically the same. So our sources.zip that we end up with here is going to contain only what we want to push. There's no point pushing the entire client project if you're going to build it first. You only want the assets that have been built. There's no point pushing anything that's related to documentation, particularly if you've got large PDFs. It's just going to slow everything down and bog everything up on the other end. So we use this to filter out what we don't want to end up on the Umbraco Cloud solution. And there's another step, actually, which is probably part of, it should be one, let's see, yeah, this one here, that's right, because it's commented out, I can't see it, I'm blind. Cloud.ignore, it just gets copied over the current .gitignore. The reason for that is what you push into your repository may not be what you want to push into the cloud's repository. If you are too restrictive in your own, you can actually break things that are meant to go into cloud. So we pretty much have a stock standard cloud gitignore, which we've renamed to cloud.ignore, and it's pretty much just what Umbraco sets up. And then we have our standard gitignore, which is for our own repository, and it has a whole heap of extra stuff that we don't want to include because, well, it's going to get compiled in, and then there's all other things as well. So so that basically gets overwritten with cloud.gitignore just to make sure that you've got in their repository only what you want in. So you can actually exclude stuff that might be in yours, but you don't want up in the cloud one. So those two files work together. The zipignore one's really good for minimizing just the amount of data that you're sending up, Whereas the git ignore, well, obviously, we're going to be checking what we're putting into the repository on cloud. Okay, so let's go back to our pipeline. So the deployment one. Where do we get to? So get our zip source. So that's pretty stock standard. It's just downloading our sources, our zip file package, the artifact. Then we have this deployment meta task. So that's effectively setting up the next deployment on Umbraco Cloud, and each deployment gets its own ID. So it's going to pull down the deployment ID as well. Then we send up that zip file of data that we want to push up on the upload package. Then we just ask it to start the deployment and wait for it to be completed and the end. This step here is the big one. Last I timed it, it was around about 9-10 minutes, because on the other end, it pushes everything up. Then it goes and commits it all into Git. Then it goes and checks it out of Git. Then it goes and does all the build, the restore packages, all of that. And then finally, it'll get into, I think it creates a Git tag as well, or something like that. I can't remember. We'll find out shortly. And finally, it'll do all the schema change deployment as well as part of that whole process. So it takes a little while. And depending where you are in the world, you could be waiting a while as well, because just getting those files up there can take a while. Coming from Australia, we used to go back and have a rest, go for a sleep for 15 minutes, and come back, and now commit might be completed, so it's all good. So a little bit more detail around these parameters, the project ID and the Umbraco Cloud API key. So if you've used Cloud before, you will know where these are, if you've used CI/CD. So you find them under Advanced in your configuration, under CI/CD flow here. So this project, you're not going to get anything out of, so I'm quite happy just sharing my API key, but I'm going to go and delete it afterwards, so it's all good. So you turn on you basically activate CI/CD. You've got your project ID and API key. On DevOps, I like to put them into a library, if you like, a variable group. And for security, I make sure that one's secret. And of course, you can also put these in Key Vault and use that instead if you really get paranoid about it, which sometimes I do. So then after that, it's pretty much smooth sailing. And this is still going, which is perfect. Let's see how it's going. All right, so you can see this wait for deployment step. And it's going, still deploying, sleep for 15 seconds. And each time it goes through and each time there's a progression, this line here is going to get longer. So currently, at this point, it's sitting at deployment started. And then this one, it says check blocking markers, create updating marker, and then it's got git clone. In the actual JSON that comes down from this API, they actually got carriage returns, but it all comes out one line in here. So one day maybe I'll get some filtering and then just truncate at the last carriage return or something. So basically this gives you a running tally of where it's at. So currently, if I keep going down, it's done the restore, we're doing the build, we've got a git stage, git commit, git tag, git push, and then down here we've got a restore.net build, we've gone through all that, and then we've got delete updating marker, and it just completed, so there you go, 8 minutes, that's probably a record. Actually, let's go and have a look at some of the previous attempts, shall we? This is always fun. Down here, 13 minutes, 17 minutes, 12 minutes. Yeah, it was pretty close to being a record. And then some failed attempts in the middle where I was trying to fix things up again. And I deleted a few because I was just embarrassed by the number that was failing. But hey, no problem. Okay, so let's go back to this, shall we? So why do we use CI/CD? All of this is fairly stock standard industry practice. You've got your pre-deploy checks, you've got your auto build of the client code and things like that. You've got your file sanitization, any security checks or vulnerability tests you might put in there. One of the things that gives you also with something like this, sure you get webhooks with Umbraco Cloud, but with something like DevOps or GitHub, you've got extra information with those webhooks. And then, of course, the big one, pull requests and code reviews, which sometimes I think I should just get someone else employed to do that for me. But I tend to do myself, and actually it's quite good because it gives me the opportunity to go back and say, hey, this needs fixing or not quite right, and just we get to have that dialogue about code. And it's great for whoever's doing the actual push as well because they get to learn something, hopefully. Security, we pretty much covered a lot of that sort of stuff. You can, there's also the upgrades, which some of the GitHub stuff, it automatically does those upgrades for you with some of this, or tries to anyway, and commits its own pull request, and then half the time you just go and say, no, I don't want it. So that's useful too. And then you've got the approval gateways and things like that, so you can actually say, I'm going to deploy, but not quite yet. Give me half an hour, and you can just delay it and things like that. Testing, automated test suites, unit tests, all of that sort of thing. And of course, if anything fails along the way, you can just abort it. In theory, anyway. So, whereas with Umbraco Cloud, you push it up and you hope for the best and hope everything goes well. And sometimes things don't. Okay, we've already done back to the demo. So, the future for CI/CD with all of this is looking pretty interesting. There's been talk recently about the whole integrating it so that you can actually use CI/CD to promote from dev to staging to live as well, which theoretically you possibly can. I don't know what the undercover, what's under the hood with that, whether they've cut that off, but I haven't tried. But maybe you could theoretically push something up into a different environment, but I suspect it's locked down to just whatever's on your first environment on the list. But there has been talk about making it so that you can actually set up, they've got to write APIs that you can then test one and push a button to deploy to the next without actually having to go into the Umbraco Cloud portal. And then there's the feature environments coming up as well, and I suspect that, or what I would hope, that we would also be able to deploy into those using CI/CD rather than going direct. And that means that even though those feature environments they're not actually a branch off the one repository, they are in themselves, each one has its own repository. But using CI/CD, you could easily have your own branch in your repository and use that branch to push up to, say, a feature branch or a totally different environment in your cloud project. All right, I'm early. I like being early. So we have some resources. We will actually go and quickly have a look at this one. This one's the samples script repository. And in here they have some Bash variations and some PowerShell variations. So we'll go into Bash for now. They also have some recipes in here for GitHub as well as DevOps. There's actually one very important distinction here, apart from the obvious with deployment through GitHub and DevOps. But if you look in this one here, it's got this pipeline vendor variable right here. And in DevOps, it's just all uppercase Azure DevOps. If you put anything else in that for the Azure DevOps one, chances are it's going to fall over. The same goes for GitHub. In the GitHub main YAML, it should, I could be wrong here. I probably am wrong. It may actually not be necessary there. But as I was sticky beaking through all the shell scripts, it was actually looking for this variable. That's probably why, because in here it's a variable, but in GitHub you would actually set it up as a variable in your environment. So it's looking for pipeline vendor, and there's actually 3 test values, and one of them is something like test or something like that. So it's probably just so that it stops it from actually going up to cloud. So he gets to that certain point, looks for it and says, I know what you are, and if I don't recognize you, I'm just going to abort. So good. But it doesn't mean you can't write your own. So you could actually, if you had, say, I don't know, Octopus deploy or something like that, you could write your own pipeline using these as a guide and go through it that way as well. So there's also a very specific way in which you set up the repository, or your file system. So the README files pretty much give you some basic instructions. The documentation on docs.umbraco are excellent. They've been well thought out and cover all of this and probably more in some ways. So they're a really great resource. You can take this and then customize it for your own needs like I have done. I've moved parts out of the templates and into the main YAML file simply because I needed certain things to happen in a certain way. And because I'm me and I like to mess with things, I also rearranged the file structure a bit, which meant that I needed to go and fix some things as well, because I'll learn one day and just go with what they give me, but I haven't got there yet. They've got a sample Cloud zip ignore there, and so I leave that alone and then just tack stuff onto the end of it. And then, of course, there's the very basic git ignore, which I think you can ignore because that's not really part of the project. You use your own. So that's the repository. These are on the, oops, hang on, where's my slide gone? There we go. These are on the resources page here. I've actually made that particular project open, public. It's very trusting of me, I know. I don't generally make my Git repositories on DevOps public, but I thought I'd see what happens, and I may be shutting it down very quickly. And then the cloud documentation itself. And that's pretty much me.
Foster, everyone. Robert Foster, everyone.